All right, Chair, we're ready when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Jillian. We're going to get this mic set up, and then I think we're ready to go. All right, here we go. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our April meeting with the Homeless Response System Steering and Oversight Committee. It is great to see everybody here. Thanks again, everyone, for making the time to be here in person. We know that Commissioner Zimmerman is going to be arriving a little bit late, but we are going to go ahead and get started. So we have an exciting agenda today that is going to focus on a huge milestone in our data development and the importance of how that can drive policy recommendations for the responses that we're bringing to fruition for homelessness. This meeting is going to be recorded and posted online for anyone who cannot attend or wants to go back and review it later. And as usual, we have a lot to cover today. I continue to encourage everyone to be mindful of the time as we go through these topics to ensure that everyone around the table gets a chance to be heard, to offer comments and questions. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Jillian to walk us through the agenda.
Sure. Chair. So first, as many of you are aware, Portland, Gresham, and Multnomah County have started their fiscal year budget processes. Departments and bureaus have submitted their requested budgets to the executives, and in the coming weeks, the proposed budgets will be released and then quickly move to the third inning of the budget process with all of their respective governing bodies weighing in what is a challenging budget year for all. Today, the three executives will speak to the status of their budgets and the lens through which they are approaching their decisions, particularly as they relate to homelessness services. And then next, recall that the leadership from the Homeless Services Department previewed significant data improvements at our last meeting. And today we pick up that conversation up again to debut those new system dashboards. But first, we will lead with additional context from ECO Northwest around the driving community level needs and the available resources to do this hard work. And for those who have seen it, this prior presentation that ECO Northwest did at a different public event, just the feedback has been really positive and will help ground all of you in this room before we see the data from the Homeless Services Department. So with that said, the goal for today is to build a shared understanding across our jurisdictions and sectors about the level of need we're observing across our community as we work toward shared investment and strategy in response to the gaps that remain. With that, I will hand it back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Jillian, for that. So as I said, we do have a lot to get through today. But I'm really glad that we are spending some time at the top of the hour talking to have Mayor Stovall and Mayor Wilson and myself just talk a little bit about our budget process. We're entering a new phase of our budget process. So we're going to take a few minutes just to report on where we are. And I think our shared priorities as we're all making difficult decisions in light of reduced revenues that we have for all of the things that we want to be able to fund. So in planning for my fiscal year 2026 proposed executive budget, county departments had submitted their recommended budgets to me a couple months ago. Additionally, I participated in 9 listening sessions with over 125 leaders in our community, hosted a virtual town hall with the public in February. And this year for our budget survey, we had over 4,000 responses where members of the public were able to directly share what their priorities were. So my executive budget is going to be released 1 week from tomorrow on April 24th. Because the county and city share this work that we are doing around homelessness through an IGA and the homelessness response system, Mayor Wilson and I have continued to discuss our shared mission for the work ahead, and that mission will be reflected in my executive budget. This mission is a homelessness response system that prevents people who are on the edge from becoming homeless and moves unsheltered people into a stable place such as shelter, interim or permanent housing, with healthcare and workforce services to end their homelessness. In making decisions, I continue to be guided by data, which is what much of today's agenda is about, to build an effective shelter system, including housing placements out of shelter. This is so important because those sleeping in a shelter are still homeless until we can find them a permanent home of their own. In the immediate term, we need a net growth in shelter beds, including amending the community sheltering strategy to add overnight shelter beds to the continuum. I embrace the culture of continuous improvement to the existing shelter system related to outreach, maximizing bed utilization, and cost, which were discussed just yesterday in a joint, in a work session with the county commissioners. Thanks to Commissioner Singleton for leading that discussion. A culture of continuous improvement was also at the heart of creating this body, the SOC, so that we could learn, respond, and improve to what was happening in our community. Budget resources should fund a balanced system, investing in prevention, emergency shelter, day centers, services, and housing placements and retention to the fullest extent possible. I also focus on addressing the disparities of people of color and other marginalized groups face via shelter access, service supports, and permanent housing. And although we are talking about our FY26 budgets this morning, I want to acknowledge that FY27 will also require hard choices. And that's why I'm asking all of us commit to begin resource and outcome plannings this summer as soon as our budgets are passed for our next fiscal year in preparation for both the annual Homeless Response Systems All Committee meeting in October and Metro's December forecast for the Supportive Housing Services Program. So these are the guiding principles as I make my decisions leading to my proposed budget, and it goes before the county board and the public for further engagement. While we still have a lot of work to do before budgets are final, I am confident that the partnership between the cities and the county will remain strong. As we will hear today from our presenters, the challenges presented to us by the homelessness crisis is too big for any one jurisdiction. We must continue to engage with other East County cities, Metro, the state, and neighboring counties. With that, I will hand it off to Mayor Wilson to speak to the status of the city budget. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. Chair is, I think, a few weeks ahead of us. Our budget will be presented on May 5th. And we've been going through the hard work really for the last 5 months, and we share a similar fiscal gap, that Chair. And so in our meetings and our discussions, we always start with this guiding principle. Our budget at the City of Portland is focused on community health and safety. And we always talk about that. In a limited gap or in a limited funding exercise, you have to understand what is the outcome you want. And so in collecting information, I see Councilor Zimmerman just showed up. I think he'll be the first person to let you know that personally I've met with the councilors, all 12 of them, at the end of this budget cycle, no less than 10 times. We've had budget listening sessions throughout all 4 districts this last month to understand what the values and the priorities are of our community. I've listened and worked with the chair and the governor at least once or twice a week, as it seems. And I thank you for the very difficult and hard and important work that we've had. It's not fun having significant gaps. I will tell you that right now. And that's where your values focus. There are 3 key guiding principles. The focus is to end the suffering on the street this year, to take action this year, to no longer work on 3- and 5-year plans, but to address and do the most we can do this year with the budgets that we have, to reduce the burden on our public safety systems so we can get back to that hard and important work of public safety. And third is to revitalize our economy, to bring that vibrancy back to the city of Portland and to the county. Now, we're still in the development phase. We still have a week left before we finalize that budget. And this is that challenging week. The anxiety is high. But I'm confident that with working with Councilor Zimmerman and the rest of my councilors, we're going to deliver a balanced budget that focuses on those values, that will really begin that point in which this meeting is really a very important conversation we have moving forward. More to come, but thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. And Mayor Stovall, I'm happy to turn it over to you to talk about your budget.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Travis Stovall, Mayor of Gresham. And our budgetary process is a little different. We have a council manager form of government. So it's our city manager that actually puts forth our city budget, which will be coming out tomorrow evening. So if anybody wants to stay tuned, we do have our budget meeting tomorrow night. If you want to check in, we'll make sure we get you the link to be able to take a look at our budget meeting. We have a small but mighty, homeless services team that's funded by $1.2 million from the joint office. So I want to start by saying that we are absolutely ecstatic that Chair Vega Peterson, the joint office of Multnomah County, has partnered with us to help us with this funding mechanism, because without this critical funding, we would not be able to move forward with the things that we do. And so this funding has absolutely allowed us to move forward with things like rental assistance, which Our 1.2 is about $600,000 more than our FY 24. So we've been able to do a lot more of that work. And we're hoping that this level of funding will continue as we go forward. I will say that, we all couch our kind of budget woes in numbers. So our general fund, which is the primary fund that allows us to do our general government services. Our general fund sits at about 115 million. I'm assuming we haven't seen the budget yet. We don't get to see it until everybody else gets to see it. So it's an interesting, unique position to be in. And so we're generally, I would estimate we're about $115 million. And with that, we still have, it was reported early on that we have about an $8.5 million shortfall in our general fund. And that's after we are actually able to pass a levy last year for public safety, which is the first levy that's passed in Gresham in 32 years. So with that said, that's the backdrop of what we're dealing with. And this funding is so critical. I want to highlight a couple of things that we've been able to move forward with in having these funds that have allowed us to actually even be more effective. And this funding has allowed us to actually go and hire 2 additional homeless services specialists in the city of Gresham, which allowed us to go from 5 days to 7 days a week in our homeless services operations, which everybody knows homeless services doesn't stop on the weekends. It continues, and we need those critical resources out there. So that added capacity just gives us a deeper level of being able to get out and working with our homeless and our houseless and our unsheltered population. Over the last fiscal year, we allocated roughly $300,000 to rental assistance, which has allowed us to actually get folks into housing and keep them in housing and avert evictions. Along those same lines, we have been able to. We have a goal of bringing folks into 55 households in this next FY 26 budget to make sure that we can continue to help people. But from July to December of this last year, we connected 128 unique individuals through street outreach, provided 317 instances of case management for clients, including connection to shelters, employment, transportation, referrals to other services, both medical and behavioral health, and food and clothing. We deployed rental assistance to permanently house 40 households last year. We're looking to increase that this next year. And so even with the backdrop of our budget challenges that I just referenced, and we will produce a balanced budget as both the county and city of Portland just referenced, we have to, it's a requirement. We will produce that, and it'll be you always have to make these hard choices. But our homeless services team, again, that's specific and unique funding through the county. And that allows us to continue that great work without it impacting anything else within our budget, and allows us to continue to delivering these great services. So we appreciate, again, the partnership with County Chair Vic Peterson and the Joint Office for assisting us in moving forward with these great efforts. And we're seeing the results. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. With that, I will turn it over to Jillian to go into the next agenda item, but appreciate the chance to share a little bit about what we're looking at. Thank you both.
Okay, and I'm just going to immediately turn it over to Madeline Miller and Dr. Mike Wilkerson, who are here with us from a local independent public policy consulting firm, Eco Northwest, which all of you are probably familiar with. And they have been working extensively to describe some of the principal drivers of homelessness, looking at both regional and national trends. And I will just hand it off to you, Madeline.
Good morning, Chair Vega Peterson, members of the committee. My name's Mike Wilkerson. I'm Director of Economic Research at Eco Northwest. And thank you for the opportunity to come and share this morning. I think as Jillian mentioned, this is a condensed version of a presentation that our colleague John Toponia presented last month at a Portland Metro Chamber event. And so here, again, we've condensed it in the interest of time, omitting some of the more technical elements of that. And certainly happy to take questions along the way. And I think the goal is to reserve time at the end for questions as well. But if there are questions along the way, certainly happy to pause and take those questions. Next slide, please. So I think we've broken down the presentation into 5 kind of key parts. I think the first is, again, unpacking the factors that influence homelessness. Grounding, I think all conversations in those understandings is helpful. And then we can move into specifically SHS, its goals, its objectives, and then crucially tracking the progress over time. We'll then move into the revenue picture, which is again backward looking and also into the forecast relevant to the conversations that you all just described in terms of the budget process. And I think crucially, the last piece, again, as we'll tee up in this first section, is the housing market indicators are also, I think, a predictive kind of component of where we see homelessness moving into the future, as those two things are intimately related. So with that, I will turn it over to Madeline to do the first couple sections.
And thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Madeline Miller. I'm a senior project manager with Echo Northwest, and I've been studying these issues alongside Mike and John for several years now. So next slide. I will step us through some of the factors that influence homelessness. There's a lot of slides on a lot of words on this slide. Shame on us, but it's a quote from this book we have in front of us. Homelessness is a housing problem. This is not necessarily a new book, but and a recent iteration with good, strong data looking at the root causes of homelessness. And as the title of the book demonstrates, the authors find that homelessness really is a housing problem. I think that's no surprise to most of you in this room. But the gist of this quote is that the authors saw that underlying causes were typically being misdiagnosed at cities and counties and local jurisdictions, with a strong focus on behavioral problems, behavioral health issues, and challenges at the individual level. We all know that that is an important part of the problem, and that at an individual level, those are predictive of an individual's risk of homelessness. They correlate. But at the community level, what the authors found is that really those risk factors do not correlate to higher rates of homelessness at the regional or community level. They have not been shown to be statistically significantly important in predicting the variation in homelessness that we see across the country. On the next slide, authors have found that really it's housing market conditions that are the most predictive and that can explain the variation in, I'm using predictive as an economics term, but that these considerations explain the variations in homelessness much more significantly than do those behavioral factors. This is a chart from the book, from the website, but it's showing the correlation between rates of homelessness along the y-axis and the community's rent, median rent in 2019 dollars. This type of analysis has been done for the last at least 20 years, and there's been a strong pattern that housing market conditions like rent, cost burdening, and vacancy are the strongest predictors of homelessness, and behavioral conditions, actually on the next slide, do not explain the variation. So in these regression analyses, which is a statistical method to look at what variables explain changes in outcomes, the rates at the community level of mental illness, illicit drug abuse, substance use disorder, temperature, poverty, and even caseloads of federal benefits like SNAP or SSI, disability, those are not correlated. So those things really matter at the individual level, but are not shown to be predictive or explaining the variation that we see across the country and across communities about where where homelessness is higher. Next slide. We just want to set that baseline. It, again, is probably not news to most of you. It's not to say that behavioral conditions and challenges are not important, and especially at the individual level, they definitely impact quality of life. But at the community level, it's the wrong focus, and we need to right-size the housing market, which Mike will certainly get into, in order to provide everyone a space and a place to go. This part of our presentation, we'll just step through the next slide. This one. Looking at the supportive housing services goals and objectives. So what was promised to voters in the pamphlet? Really, I won't read this, but the measure established the regional supportive housing funding program with a strong emphasis on providing services in the title, supportive housing services. So really the only promise to voters was that there would be a substantial increase in the delivery of services. And as we'll see in the next section, that has happened. So these are the goals from Metro's website. This is just a screenshot of their website. 10-year regional goals are to connect 5,000 households to permanent supportive housing and stabilize 10,000 households. And that's over 10 years. We can flip to the next two slides, the next section. As you'll see in this presentation, the Metro region has already actually exceeded their goals. They're doing amazing work and we're already past those 10-year goals. So these are snapshots again from the website showing the number of households placed in housing, already over 7,000. Number of evictions that were prevented, 17,000. That can go towards that stabilization goal. And the number of shelter units created. These are regional numbers, not specific to Multnomah County, but demonstrate the immense work that has already gone into this work, into this effort, only 4 years since the money started flowing, really. On the next slide, we show that the increase in total housing inventory beds. You can see this goes all the way back to 2008. And this strong increase right around 2021 and 2022, when money really started flowing into the region from the delay in passing the measure and then collecting the funding. You can see that strong uptick. The next slide breaks it down by bed type. This housing inventory count is a similar effort to the point in time count. So it's conducted at the regional and at the COC level and at the regional level every couple of years and sent to HUD. You can see the strong increases in permanent supportive housing. That's been an effort in the region for a really long time, that strong upward trend line there. You can see some variation in emergency shelters. That's the next in this maybe green line, showing a peak in 2013 at the last recession, but then some declines in the middle of the strong economy in the teens, and then picking back up again with the supportive housing services funding. The yellow line is rapid rehousing. This can be both a bed and a program. It's intended to get people back in, quickly respond back into a stable housing situation. And then really the biggest uptick has been on this other permanent housing type. I don't exactly know what's packed into those numbers. I'm sure some other people in this room do, but you can see that that has been a huge increase and probably the biggest driver of the strong slope increase on the prior slide since the money started moving in 2021. And on the next slide, this is a really fascinating chart that just kind of puts our region into context with other cities around the country. It is normalized on city size. So we have a wide range of cities here, and there's a few counties thrown in here as well because of the geographic difference between the COCs and where the data is collected, and then some cities. We're trying to normalize it as best we can, but this really shows the ratio of unsheltered to total people experiencing homelessness. Unsheltered being the green bar and total being the orange bar. Again, these are normalized. So what it's really showing is that if the bars are closer together, you have a higher share of your population experiencing unsheltered homelessness. It makes sense in some of the more temperate climates. You can see Denver and New York City have a larger increase in the two bars. And obviously New York City stands out here for its really high bar. It has a very severe homelessness problem, but they also have a right to shelter law. And so their rate of unsheltered homelessness is actually very, very, very low relative to their total rate of homelessness. And I believe that's the last for my section, so I'll pass it back.
Thanks. Next slide, please. One more. So I think, again, the mechanism by which the revenue is collected is generally well known. It's a marginal personal income tax above 200,000 or 125 for individual tax filers, and then businesses profits over 1% are taxed, with exemptions for small businesses with gross receipts less than 5 million per year. Next slide, please. I think this is probably the most telling slide in the presentation, which is when you look at public policy analysis, a simple rule should be that the resources should be commensurate with the size of the problem. And when we look at this slide, what we see is the point in time count as a measure relative to the revenue share. And I think it's what this slide is showing is an unrealistic expectation that in the case of Multnomah County, the point in time count share is 80% of the region, while the funding is less than 50% of the region. And the Inverse is the case in Washington and Clackamas County, which is to say the resources they're receiving are disproportionate with the level of their problem. And so how you measure success when you're starting from a place that looks like this is very challenging to do versus if all counties had a similar relationship between their revenue stream and the size of the problem would be an easier way to think about measuring outcomes across counties. Next slide, please. So what John and others in our firm have been tracking is trying to unpack the various sources of funding. This is looking last year. I think the 2024 data is now recently released and will be coming out. I think what we're expecting to see is the SHS increasing its prominence in terms of share of funding. In the last year, 2023, it was close to 30%. I think the expectation is it could be as high as 40% of all resource. That's for two reasons. One, ARPA and other federal funds are decreasing and the receipts coming in through the tax are increasing. So when you put those two levers together, the total resource is likely to increase from 530 million to maybe close to 700 million in 2024. And again, the share of SHS is going to approach 40%. And so it's by far and away the single largest source of funding as it relates to homelessness in the region. Next slide, please. There's a lot going on in this slide. I think the challenge we have going forward is lots of economic uncertainty. And the funds come through at various points throughout the year with big step ups typically around the time that people are filing their taxes in and around this time of the year. And so if we're trying to understand what the next fiscal year looks like in terms of 25, there's immense economic uncertainty going forward, but the first, let's say 6 months of this fiscal year, we have seen receipts coming in and around where they were in fiscal year 24, which leads us to believe that it's likely that resources will come in at a similar level. If we go to the next slide, I think John called this John Zaponia, our colleague, the fiscal valley of death. Why? Well, I think it, on appearance, doesn't look like the decline in revenue is meaningful. But at a time when the cost of delivering services is increasing at a rapid rate and your revenues are decreasing, that delta really is meaningful. And so what this, I think, is looking at, and this is largely coming from Metro forecasts around how much revenue will be coming in. The expectation is because of the economic conditions for the next year or 2 years or 3 years, revenue will be down from where it was in the previous fiscal year. And for all the budgetary reasons we've discussed, I think this is one of those challenges that it's likely to persist. How severe an economic correction we're facing, I think, is anyone's guess at this point, unfortunately. Next slide, please. So housing economics is a very nuanced and complicated topic. I talk regularly in increments of semester-long classes or hour to 2 hour presentations. Here, I'm going to try to do my best to step through the high points in 5 slides or so. But if there are questions, certainly happy to take those. Next slide, please. I think, if you're looking at the condition of any housing market, and the literature shows this, it's the combination of vacancy rates, and vacancy rates drive costs and drive rents. And if we're looking at every state across the country, we can look at the vacancy rate, which is effectively how many housing units do you have for every household. Oregon is the second most constrained market in the country. And it has been as low as number 1 and kicks around the 1, 2, or 3 every single year. So it should come as no surprise then when we look at the downstream impacts as it relates to homelessness that we're also, unfortunately, near the top because homelessness is a housing problem. Next slide, please. If we look at affordability across the region, I think we can look at that in 2 ways. One is ownership. And as ownership becomes increasingly less attainable, we then look at the rental housing market as more important as it relates certainly to risk of homelessness. If we go back to 2019, median family incomes were in around the $90,000 amount. If we assumed a 20% down payment, which is very challenging to do at the prices in our market at median family incomes of $90,000 because of things like elevated cost burdening rates, putting aside that crucial distinction around how attainable 20% is, there were still limited pockets of housing affordability at the median income. Those are all those pockets in green. So East County, Gresham, large parts of Vancouver, some pockets in Beaverton, it was possible to afford the median home with the median income. If we look today in 2024, next slide, please, affordability is essentially gone. And that is for primarily because housing prices have continued to go up and interest rates have increased. And so even with a 20% down payment today and a median income of roughly 117,000, the ability to afford a home is effectively not present if you're earning the median income. Next slide. What we then look at is, I think the primary indicator in terms of the mechanism by which risk impacts individual household, which is inability to handle any changes in income or adverse circumstance or lack of saving. And we can look at renter household cost burdening rates as kind of that most important and predictive indicator. What we see is more than 75% of renter households are cost burdened at incomes of less than 60% of the area median income. That means they're spending more than 30% of their income. And in fact, half of those households spend 50% of their income and are severely cost burdened. What that indicates is any increase in rent and or adverse condition puts you precariously on that chance of falling into homelessness. What I would say is this is not unique to Multnomah County. Clackamas, as you can see, and Washington County are similar and even elevated at low income levels. I think what maybe is a little bit counterintuitive is the lowest income households, 0 to 30, actually have slightly lower, albeit very elevated rates of cost burdening. And that is because of the success of programs like supportive housing services that target specifically 0 to 30 households, whereas those programs aren't always the case and available at 30 to 60. So that might explain some of the reasons why the 30 to 60 cost burdening rates are a little bit higher than 0 to 30. Next slide, please. There's always one chart in every presentation that is overly complex. This is it. There is a good reason why it is here. And that is to say, certainly supply is the primary driving factor around why we have a housing problem. There's immense literature discussing that. I think a less well-known impacting factor is the ability for households to compete in a constrained market. And when households compete for a constrained number of units, the highest income households always win. And what that means is when you look at the rent of a unit relative to the household's income that's occupying it, you don't have a perfect match. In fact, you have immense amounts of mismatch, particularly with high income households renting down. And so even if you had, let's say, an appropriate vacancy rate and you built housing commensurate with that, that doesn't mean that cost burdening goes away. It means that cost burdening is still a problem, and things like rent assistance, vouchers, et cetera, demand side interventions are going to be needed to bring the market completely into balance, and that supply alone can never be the answer. Next slide. I think, unfortunately, what we're facing is broad macro market conditions that are impacting delivery of housing. This is everywhere, and it's particularly pronounced in the city of Portland, where if we look historically over the last decade, 3,000 to 4,000 housing units have been permitted a year. In the last calendar year of 2024, that was less than 900. And in the first 3 to 4 months of this year, we're seeing trends in line with that again, to where the expectation is we'd see a similar number of units permitted in the next year. And again, these include all units, subsidized and market rate. Next slide, please. I think what that unfortunately gives us an indication into is vacancy rates are going to be declining. And as vacancy rates decline, rent pressures are going to increase. And so when we look at the number of units that are under construction now, it's the lowest we've seen since 2011. And we know that the permitting pipeline is lower than it's been, and that is going to continue to put pressure on that. And as fewer units are delivered, like I said, vacancy rates are going to go down, and we now know that rent is going to continue to escalate more over the next several years, which again is the primary leading indicator of risk. Next slide, please. So To summarize these key takeaways, I think we have a couple of bullet point takeaways. Next slide, please. I think again, as we've noticed, SHS has become the single largest source, and going forward, it will only increase its prominence. Next slide. We have seen an expansion in inventory as Madeline went through the data. So again, this is not a coincidence. This is because of the increase of funding that's available to support these types of deliveries. Next slide. I think the challenge is the program's goals are activity-based, and we've seen that largely those have already been met or exceeded in 4 out of a 10-year timeline. The outcomes base is much harder to understand, and that is, I think, a crucial distinction. Next slide, please. What the literature increasingly is finding through randomized controlled trials and other experiments, and we've saved that technical part for this presentation today, is that targeting interventions is inherently challenged, particularly if you're using the point in time count as your measure of success. I think the by name list approach, which we'll talk about later, does help with that because it's an improved methodology over a point in time count. Next slide. This is just a simple anecdote, I think, of many examples of the media covering this topic. And they use an example here in the LA Times of a person who's precariously housed. And if you, I think, click ahead one more. The example here is this particular individual splits time between living in their family member's garage, motels at times, living in their car, at times camping. And so from a point in time count estimate, you're never going to fully capture this person's in and out of various situations. And so when we're thinking about what a emergency shelter does versus a permanent supporting housing, it's not like you get a 1-for-1 reduction in the point in time count. I think that's the challenge. Is the assumption broadly is, well, if we're funding and we're seeing an improvement in all these outcomes, why is it that the point in time count isn't decreasing? This is one of those reasons. Is it's not a straight 1-for-1 reduction, unfortunately. Next slide, please. So I think, again, as we've outlined here today, that the principal driver of the region's homelessness crisis is housing scarcity and high rents, and these have not improved since the onset of SHS, which then I think unfortunately bodes a continuation of the trends that we're seeing today. Next slide, please. I think what is clear, though, is an abrupt end of this funding stream in 2030 is going to be a challenge, I would say catastrophic for the region in terms of its ability to address this ongoing crisis. And would just continue to put upward pressure on rent. So I think those are the bulk of our slides, and appreciate your time and certainly happy to take questions if there are any.
We do have a few minutes for questions. We can also hold questions until after the HSD presentation on the new data and dashboard. But if somebody has a pressing question, feel free to raise your hand. Okay. Oh, Peter.
Very quick, do you have an example of an outcome-based versus an activity-based goal that would be effective or been used in other places?
I don't know that I have a specific example. There are others here, but I think the distinction is really around you're using your point in time count or your by name list as your kind of measures of success rather than your delivery of shelters or permanent supportive housing or other things as the indicator that you're trying to track. How you go about doing that, I think we'll hear shortly the advantages of using a by name list versus a point in time count as an example of a methodology that's probably more effective for that.
Some communities do measure functional zero, where the inflow matches the outflow, and that's only possible with better data. You can't do that with a point in time count.
I can, Peter, if I might add, activity-based versus outcome-based. Activity is like Mike had noted, where we target 5,000 people that are experiencing chronically homeless to address in the SHS and 10,000 for those that are at risk of. That's an activity, and we've far exceeded it. An outcome would be to say, we're going to reach functional zero at a particular date and time. That is an outcome with a specific mission, and that's completely different than activity. And that's one of the critical reasons we're here right now. So
I would just add, this is a part of the discussion happening at the President's Work Group with Metro about SHS reforms and how do we right-size KPIs. And so hopefully there'll be more to share shortly, but we're in the early stages still of that conversation.
But I think that, and I love how clearly it was pointed out, activity versus outcome, because I think the expectations in the community was not about the activity goals, which were basically what the measure was based on. Instead, people were looking for the outcome base, and that wasn't what the measure was built for, designed for. And so I appreciate the work that is happening now to really match that up. And again, that was part of the driver of setting this table and really having outcomes-based goals for Multnomah County because it was missing at that level. Appreciate your work here.
I appreciate that, Chair, and we'll speak to this a little bit after Page's presentation.
Yeah.
Great. So too as well, Mayor Wilson. All right, Chair.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you so much for the presentation today. It was really, I think it helps give a lot of context to what we're going to be hearing at the data. And hopefully when we have a deeper discussion and question and answer period, we can combine these two topics to really help talk about what we're going to be doing next now that we're at this point. But this is a really exciting day and an exciting milestone for our work in addressing our homelessness crisis. So last month we were joined with Anna Plum, the Deputy Director of our Homeless Services Department, who presented on the ambitious system-wide data improvements that the department has been leading over the past year with placeholder numbers. So we were able to get a brief glimpse into that. But today, I'm really glad to be able to say that the dashboard with the actual data is going live. So I'm glad, Anna, thank you for being back here to present with the real information today. For the last 2 decades, much of our community's reporting on the numbers of people experiencing homelessness were driven by the point-in-time count. And we actually saw that was the number that was used in the Eco Northwest presentation. That's a very high-level biannual data and hand count of people sleeping in shelters and in the streets. We've long known that is actually an undercount, and we know, though, that it's been what's required of the federal government, and for a long time it was the only tool that we had. Now we have our own local tool, a new tool that significantly enhances our understanding of who is experiencing homelessness by providing data from the most accurate by name list of people experiencing homelessness that Multnomah County has ever produced. So starting today, we have a new baseline of information available to help us measure our work, and that is a very important milestone. So as you will see in this presentation, the numbers have increased. That, one of the things that means is that we are actually doing a better job of identifying people who need help. The work of transformation is really hard. We can't ignore this data. Nobody in this room wants to be ignoring this data, but we really need to take up the challenge that it presents us to do more and to do better. This data also validates what many of us have experienced over the last 5 years, that far too many people are sleeping on the streets in Multnomah County. So I will leave it to Anna to really walk through all the different elements of the dashboard and all of the different data systems improvements. There's a lot there. But I will say, because of this effort, every community partner, every jurisdiction, and the public will now have a clear understanding of our homelessness crisis in Multnomah County, and our elected leaders will have better data to inform policy and budget decisions. So after Anna presents, we'll then transition to questions and answers and discussions. So thank you, and take it away.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Plum. I'm the Deputy Director for the Homeless Services Department, and I'm excited to launch this data dashboard here with you all today. We are going to start by a brief reminder of what we mean when we say HMIS and by name list. I talked about this more in depth last month, so for those of you who were here last month, it'll be a bit of a review. We'll talk about why the population data matters, which we've heard a little bit about already, and then we will walk through some elements of the new population and service data. We'll start by talking about what we expect with better data collection, and then how this data will help us reduce homelessness. And I will spend some time talking about further improvements that are also on the horizon for our community. Again, I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, but when we say HMIS, that essentially means that is a data system where we enter information about folks who are accessing our homeless services. Data is collected during service interactions, and the data is built upon those service interactions. So we collect 3 kind of major pieces or kinds of data about folks as they access our services. One of those is participant data. So name, date of birth, information that allows us to identify folks. And that information is really key to the by name list, because that's how we know who is here and we can pick out individual folks. We also collect information about services. If someone stays a night in a shelter, that is entered into the HMIS system, and we know that that person is in that shelter unit. When that person accesses housing, that is also entered into the system. So those are the three major buckets of data. We have defined standards for how that data is collected, and all of our providers are required to enter their data into HMIS, and we have standards for how that is done and how it is defined. We do data quality checks to make sure things are entered accurately, and we have recently done some work to better align what we're asking for in our contracts with what we put in our budget and what we put in our performance dashboard. So we're doing a lot of work to make sure this data is as clean as possible, and we can follow it all the way through from the contract to our performance metrics. The reason I'm sort of highlighting that this is service-based data is that's going to make a big difference when we talk about the numbers itself, because what we see is that as we increase our services, we find more folks, we speak with more folks, we serve more folks, more data goes into the system, and the list increases. So when we talk about the numbers, I want to keep in mind that this is all service-based data, and part of the increase is that we are finding more people in our community and serving them with our services. One thing I want to note about the HMIS data, one more thing, Maggie, sorry, it's okay if you stay here. I do want to note that Multnomah County is the administrator of this system, and we've had that role for just over a year. Prior to last March, the HMIS system was administered by the Portland Housing Bureau, and they had a very small staff. We were able to take over that role last year, and we were preparing for that role for a very long time to dive in as quickly as possible to do some intensive data modernization efforts. What you're seeing today is one of several data modernization projects we've been doing, and we're really excited to have that opportunity to show it to you today. Okay, so what is a by name list? A by name list is exactly what it sounds like. It is a deduplicated list of people that we can identify by name to better understand who is experiencing homelessness in our community. You'll see that we can look at it in terms of a snapshot of who's homeless and where they are, but we will also look at inflow and outflow. And again, this is all built on service data, so it's interactions in the system. So you might hear folks say inflow or outflow into homelessness. More technically, it's inflow into our data system of folks we understand to be accessing our services. And from the service data, we can tell if they are homeless, recently housed, what services they're using, et cetera. So what are we doing? For the first time, we are able to show a lot more detail about who we know to be homeless. This is a major improvement upon the point in time count, as you've heard. We will be showing, and I'll show you some snapshots in a minute, every month a snapshot of who we understand to be homeless and where we think they are in the major buckets of are they in shelter, are they unsheltered, or do we understand them to be homeless, but we're not exactly sure where they are. That is sort of a group in our list. We will also be able to show who we see coming into homelessness via our service database and who we see flowing out. And I'm going to talk about sort of how we think about that in another slide. All of this information will also include demographics. We will look at race, age, gender, and veteran status to know who is experiencing homelessness in our community and how those proportions might be changing over time. One thing that I want to note is that part of our data modernization efforts were to make sure that list was deduplicated. So we have done a lot of work over the last year to go into our data system and remove duplicates. Folks are accessing services across the community, and so they might say slightly different things or give slightly different pieces of information to different service providers. With the modernization efforts that we've been able to do and our increases in services, we can now identify folks who are in that list more than once and remove those. That's been a major piece for us to getting to this dashboard today. The dashboard also has improved service data. We already report on a quarterly basis a lot of outcomes for our system. We will now be showing those monthly. And there are a couple things that we haven't been able to show before that we are now able to show about housing and shelter and prevention. So I'll walk through some of those as well. We also have improved information on chronic homelessness, which I will highlight as we walk through the dashboard. So why does this matter? It's a data dashboard. Why is that a big deal? And thank you for the excellent explanation of why that matters to Eco Northwest. But essentially, we need to make data-driven decisions to lead to reductions in homelessness. As the chair said, we will now know who is entering and leaving the system, including who is housed, who is staying in shelter, when people are leaving, and what that looks like. This will help us with coordination, it'll help us with transparency, and it'll help us with accountability. We can look at that data to make actionable insights to help us make informed decisions about our policy and what we're doing to serve folks in our community. This will set up our frontline workers, our decision makers, and our community to understand all at the same time what we're doing and what we need to do more of and where we could improve. Next slide. So I want to pause before we get into the numbers and talk about what we expect when we get to this point in our data quality. This is a major milestone for us in our ability to understand the impact of our work, but we also know that when communities get to this point, they actually expect to see a higher active homeless number on their list. We have worked closely with Community Solutions, which is a national nonprofit that is working with cities and counties across the country to change how they work and to use data to better reduce homelessness. They have been a partner with us for years along the way as we prepared for this work. And one thing that they say over and over again is that as you increase your services, which we have done, and as you improve your data collection and your data management, you expect to see an increase in your by name list. So this is something that, as the chair noted, the numbers are going up. We think that is a factor in many ways of our improved data tracking and our service reach. There are also, as you'll see, more folks entering our system, but we do want to be clear that it's a combination of our better work and the crisis on our streets. One thing I want to note is up until now, when we talk about the data and with the point in time data, it's been really difficult to make a correlation between changes in the data and actual changes on the ground in the community, because there's been a lot of noise in the data. We haven't had a reliable data set. We talk about wanting to look at outcomes. And up until now, it's been hard to say this data change is a reflection of what we're doing on the streets. The level of comprehensiveness that we have in our data now, the level of quality that we have, from now moving forward, it'll be much easier to say, we see the data changing and we think we can link that to what we're doing or not doing and make improvements therein. So it's a big deal for us to have this so we can use the data more effectively moving forward. Oh, go back one more. So I'm getting into the numbers now, and I want to start by looking at what we produced last year in January 2024. So last year was the first time that we published information from our by name list. And at the time, we said there were 11,153 people experiencing homelessness. That's what you see on the slide. We have reanalyzed that data with our new scripts and our newly deduplicated data, and we see some changes. And I just want to call that out so that we can get ahead of that question, because we are going to compare January to January in our next slide. You can see that we actually found more people overall experiencing homelessness in that month. So the data went up by a couple hundred. But I want to call out the difference in the unsheltered number. We had previously said there were about 5,400 people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. That actually the more sort of updated data is actually a little bit lower. The differences here are due to two major factors. Number one, I spoke about deduplication. We went through and deduplicated folks in our data. So I think the decrease in the unsheltered is likely related to that. The overall increase we think is likely due to data maturation. We pulled those numbers in February 2024. And that was simply not enough time for some of our providers to get all of their data entered. What you will see on the website is right now we are in April. The most recent month we're going to show is February 2025. We're going to have a lag to give two things. Number one, to give our providers the time to get their data entered. And we are working on more timely data entry in some certain very important places, but also to give us time to then do the deduplication, make sure the data is accurate before we publish it on the website. So that's the major reasons for this difference are those two factors, but I do want to call that out because it's different than what we've talked about over the last year. Okay. So here are the numbers, and I must apologize if it's small. You do all have this in front of you in paper as well. This is the information that we have been waiting to share, that we've been excited to share with you. Up top are January 2024 to January 2025 changes in our by name list. The very first row shows you that there has been an increase on our by name list of folks experiencing homelessness of about 2,900 people. That's a 26% increase in the number of people on the list. This is, of course, not what anyone wanted to see. This is not what we were hoping we would see, but again, it was what we maybe sort of expected to see based upon our expansion of our services and also on the data modernization and data collection work that we've been doing. This is a hard number to look at. I just want to pause and acknowledge this is not what we wanted to see, but it also means that we have a better sense of what's actually going on in our community, and we can use that information to do better work. Looking at the sort of places that folks were on that list, we saw increases in the sheltered count. Up to 4,800 people were sheltered and 6,200 were unsheltered. That's an increase of about 26% in the unsheltered count. And we do still have a number of folks for whom we are pretty certain they're homeless, but we're not exactly sure where they were. So we can't say for sure if they were sheltered or unsheltered at that time. So that's the monthly snapshot, and we'll look at what that looks like over time back to January 2024 in just a moment. But I want to talk again about this other major new element of our information is inflow and outflow into and off of the list of folks experiencing homelessness. We will also look at this graphically, but while I have your attention with the boring chart, I'm going to go through the definitions because I think it's important to understand what we have here. When we talk about inflow, we talk about that in 3 different ways. You can see that inflow was 1,277 folks entering our list in January 2025. We break that down into 3 major categories. Newly identified are folks that we have not seen in our data system before. We have enough information about them that we know that they have not been in our system. So they are newly on our list and could be understood to be newly homeless. We're not sure they're newly homeless. It's very possible they were homeless and hadn't accessed services before. So that's a nuance that I want to be really clear about, but we have not seen them in our data system, which means we have not served them up until this point. The second category is inflow from inactive status. And you'll see that as a part of outflow as well. So inactive is if somebody has been using our services, they're in our data system. If they close out of all programs, for example, they exit a shelter bed, and that's the only program they were in. If we don't have any other interactions with them in our data for somewhere between 90 and 180 days, it depends upon the circumstances, they're moved to inactive. So that inflow from an inactive status, those are folks who were moved to inactive. We hadn't seen them in a while and they pop back up in our data. They're accessing a service that makes us understand that they are experiencing homelessness. So that's that inflow category. We also have inflow, which is return from housing. These are folks who have been housed via our programs. We know from our data they entered into a housing placement, and then we find them again in a data system, in a data process. For example, they show up in a shelter unit. That makes us understand this person is experiencing homelessness again. We will also look at outflow, and we look at that in 2 major ways. Again, folks who are moving to inactive, we haven't heard from them in a while. They're not accessing our system, so we move them to inactive. And then, of course, people who are outflowing from the list because they are moving into housing, which is the ultimate goal. So what are the key takeaways? There are many, and we'll spend some time on this, but one thing that we don't actually have on the chart, but I do want to call out, is people are moving off the list, but there are also a lot of people who are staying on our list. We did look at, of the folks who were on that by name list in January 2024, how many of them are still on the list? And what we saw is about 48% of the folks remain on the list. They are still on our list of folks experiencing homelessness. This matches what we understand about chronic homelessness. You'll see in a few slides that about half of the folks on our list are experiencing chronic homelessness. So that is a major group of folks who have a high need in our community. That being said, there are just under 6,000 people who were no longer on our list of folks experiencing homelessness. They were on the list in January 2024. They are no longer on that list today. So we are going to do some work. We haven't had time yet. All these numbers are quite fresh. We're going to do some work to look at where those folks are. They could have been moved into housing, they could have left the community, or they could have stopped accessing services for other reasons that we don't fully understand at this moment. But that is something we will be looking at in the future as well. And then the major thing that we saw in that year-to-year comparison, and you'll also see it in our data, is that despite really steady outflow to housing, our inflow is outpacing our outflow very consistently. And this is, thank you again for setting this up, Beacon Northwest. I appreciate the support. What we see is that people are entering homelessness faster than we can return them to housing. And I'll show some data on who we are serving in housing. We are serving thousands of people in housing, and yet people are entering homelessness at a faster rate. And we know why this is happening. And a lot of those elements are outside of the control of the Homeless Services Department. We have a housing shortage, which you heard a lot about today. We have a lack of affordable housing that is exceptionally difficult. Right now, our eviction cases are highest than they were in a decade. And we know that inflation is increasing the cost of people's basic needs, which makes them choose between rent, food, utilities. It's very difficult to be cost burdened in this city, in this county. We also know that there are other factors that make individual circumstances difficult. We have a need for better mental health care and medical health care in this community. We know that we are struggling with a fentanyl crisis as well. So there are other factors that make this more difficult as well. Okay, so again, sorry, this is so small on your screen. This is the preview of the data dashboard. It is live. Your slides have the wrong URL. The correct URL is up in the corner on the slides. You just have to add dashboard. This website is live and you can go and look at this data. I decided not to try to do it live in front of all of you all because as we all know, a website never loads when you're trying to use it live. So I'm just going to show you screenshots today. But if you go to the population dashboard, this is what you'll see. Up top, you will have a snapshot of the most recent month of who is experiencing homelessness overall. And that will be broken down into the dark green, which is unsheltered, the sort of orange, which is sheltered, and then the lighter green, which is unknown. And this is what you can see right now is we are showing what that looks like from January 2024 through today. It is loading, just so you know. Oh, good, great. Like better you than me trying to do that while I talk. And you'll be able to select a year to display. Right now, we have it all the way back to January 2024 because that's the first time we produced data. We wanted to show the pattern from then until now. I do want to note that if you hover, you'll be able to see a brief definition. We also, throughout the website, have links to a more extensive glossary, and I think you have one of those glossaries in your packet because we get that it's a little bit wonky and some of the definitions are confusing. We want to be really clear about what we mean by the words that we use. So you will have access to a glossary online, and those of you here have that as well. I talked about inflow. We also are going to show on a regular basis the difference between inflow and outflow onto that list of folks experiencing homelessness. This is what it looks like. And as I said, we see that inflow is outpacing outflow almost every month except for one. That dark green line is inflow onto the list and the yellow line is outflow. So when we talk about inflow, this is a serious challenge to our community. The next slide breaks that down so we can talk about those three categories I mentioned earlier. Who is inflowing and in what way? The dark green bar that is the majority of what you see, that is new to system. Again, those are folks who might be newly homeless. They might be new to our community, or they might have been in this community for a long time, been homeless for some period of time and just now accessing services. But we do see a lot of folks entering new to our system on a monthly basis. The middle bar, that sort of light green, that is return from permanent housing. So again, those are folks that we house via our services. We have an entry into a housing program and a placement into housing from our program. And we see them showing up in our population of folks experiencing homelessness. The last category is folks who again, who return from inactive. Folks who we moved to inactive that are showing back up in our population. This is how folks leave the list. So this is outflow. And we break this into two major categories. And again, there are pretty robust definitions of these in your glossary if you want to know more. The dark orange is folks who are moving off the list into housing. And the light orange is folks who are moving to inactive. Again, this data is pretty fresh for us, but one thing that's very interesting to me is we have a lot of folks moving to inactive every month and a much lower number of folks coming back in from that inactive list. I don't know what that means yet, but that's one of the things we might choose to look at. We're going to have a lot of questions based on this data, and we're going to have to be judicious with what we ask and when we ask it, but that's one thing, for example, that we could look at to understand more. Next slide. And we also, I'm only going to show one of these screenshots, but for almost everything you see here, and I'll remind you of this later, we will show demographics. So this is a look at what are the characteristics of that population of people experiencing homelessness. And this shows you what it looks like by race and ethnicity for February 2025. You will be able to select other demographics and other months. So you can look at this across time as well to help us understand if we're having an impact on our priority populations as we serve folks. I talked a little bit about chronic homelessness, and this is just, again, another screenshot. Everything that I just showed you is about all population, and it can all be filtered to look at people who are experiencing chronic homelessness. We also use the phrase population A, those of us who are sort of more jargony. That is just a wider definition of folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness. And what this shows us is that there are 7,400 people, almost 7,500 people experiencing chronic homelessness in our community. Chronic homelessness is sort of broadly defined as longer term or cyclical homelessness, coming in and out of homelessness multiple times and having someone in the household with a major disability. So this is a high needs population that will probably need more support to be sustainably housed moving forward. Okay, I'm going to move to services, but I'm going to take a step first. So that was the population data. And now I want to talk about our services data. Because the second aspect of this dashboard is better information about the services that we are providing in the community. What we have here is actually all information we share now, but I think it's easier to look at and easier to understand in our new design. This is looking at shelter occupancy. So up top, you can see a monthly average of the total units of shelter that were available and how many of those that were occupied. And this will refresh every month to say right up top how many of shelters were occupied. And you can see that in February 2025, basically 92% of shelter units were occupied on a nightly basis. We then have that over time below, so you can look across time, what's happening with availability of shelter units, how many do we have, and how occupied are they. We also, of course, want to understand where folks are exiting from shelter. This is new. Having this data available on a monthly basis is new for our community. And you'll see, I don't have it here because I was trying to only select certain things, so I don't bore you, but you'll also see a monthly snapshot of what exits looked like that month. But this is a look over time of how are people exiting shelter. And we have three categories: permanent housing, homelessness, and then temporary housing, the institutional setting, or other sort of smaller categories. Again, that's very specifically defined in your glossary. You'll be able to look, it's very small for you looking at the screen, but you can select shelter type. You can look at congregate, motel, alternative, for example, if you want to drill down into type. You can look at system type, so adult shelter, family shelter, et cetera. And you can also select, again, for those folks who are experiencing chronically homeless as well. So there's ways you can sort of slice and dice this data to understand how our shelter system is functioning. I do want to make a note about that exit to homelessness data, because that is one thing that is a little bit hard to understand, because we do have folks who move from one shelter to another. If they move from one shelter to another, that is considered in our data an exit to homelessness, because you are still homeless when you are living in a shelter. So I want to highlight that that is something that we might need to dig in a little bit more nuance as we move forward. One thing we know, and we've talked about this in recent presentations, is our motel shelters often take referrals from congregate shelters. So this could include someone who was staying in a congregate shelter, was moved to a motel shelter, where they will then stabilize and have an exit into housing. So this is a place where this, to me, is not necessarily a failure, because it includes people moving to a program that fits them better and might better help them stabilize and then move into housing.
If that's the case, what is the temporary housing institutional setting or other mean? What examples do we have?
So temporary housing, well, institutional setting could be like a hospital or a jail. And temporary housing has a couple different definitions. Lori, can you help me out with what one of those would be? If not, I can follow up.
Yeah, well, any transitional housing that has to do, or sometimes some of the motel shelters also fit in this temporary housing category. Or recovery.
To repeat in the mic, I'll say that. Oh, sorry, Shane.
Oh, I said recovery. We missed kind of that
Yeah.
word, which I think.
Yeah,
is
so
helpful.
recovery housing, that's temporary, transitional housing. If someone were to say, I'm gonna go stay with my mom for a few days, for example, that might be here, because it's not permanent, but it's also not like a shelter setting or home.
And I will say glossary is
Yes.
super helpful, because that it's great to have these like official definitions.
Yeah. I don't have to memorize. I did my best. That's why we have glossary. So this next dashboard, I'm actually really excited about, because I think we have struggled to show some really important service data that I'm really excited to show you about housing. So I'm moving on from shelter to our housing data. And this is a look at who we are serving in our housing programs. Again, up top, a number will populate with an update for that month, and then you'll see patterns over time. You'll see three major numbers up top. The first one is for February 2025. There were 7,600 people who are currently housed in publicly funded housing programs as of February 2025. We break that down into new placements and folks being sustained in programs. And that people being sustained is what we haven't been able to show up until now. And I think it's very, very important. And I'm so glad we can show that to you. So in February 2025, 218 people were newly placed into housing, but there were almost 7,400 people who were being sustained in housing by our programs. What that means is they are enrolled in a rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing program. They are receiving rent assistance and they are receiving case management. What that also means is that's 7,400 people who would be on the by name list if they were not in housing because of our services. So when you look at the increase in the list, I also want you to think about these 7,000 people being sustained in housing by our programs today or in February. You can also look at this list by intervention type. So that is primarily via permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing. If you select there, you'll see a lot of this is folks in permanent supportive housing, which you would expect to see that continuing across time because folks are going to stay. The concept of permanent supportive housing is that folks are in that long term. So the bulk of this number is folks in permanent supportive housing. The yellow line is people who are seeking housing, that 4,200. Those are folks who are enrolled in a housing program. They have a housing case manager, for example, and they are working towards that housing placement, but they are not yet housed. So that's just another way to understand services that we haven't really been able to show as well in the past. Slide. This is not new, but I do want to highlight it. This is looking at housing retention. So for rapid rehousing, this is post-subsidy. They're no longer on that line of folks being sustained in housing because they're no longer in a housing program. They've exited from that housing program. They're not receiving rent assistance or case management anymore. When that happens, we do check on folks to see, are you retaining that housing? Were you able to sustain that housing once our support went away? And we look at that at 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months. So this is just showing that for rapid rehousing. When I talk about the end of subsidy, that's for rapid rehousing. Again, permanent supportive housing, the concept is folks remain in that program. So that's a little bit different. So you can see 83% of folks in our rapid rehousing programs are in that housing 2 years after their subsidies. Finally, we also have information on who is accessing our prevention programs, and that's eviction prevention, so helping people avoid becoming homeless in the first place. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but we can just show across time who was accessing those services. And you can see there were 5,600 people in February who were enrolled in eviction prevention programs to help them avoid becoming homeless. Again, staying off that list. I highlighted this before, but I want to drill down on this. All of what I showed you, you will be able to also look at who is being served by demographics, by race, by age, by gender, and by veteran status. Who is being served in shelter? Who is exiting from shelter? Who is being served in housing? And what does retention look like for people with those different demographic groups, as well as who is accessing those prevention services? I'm highlighting this because this information is crucial. One of our goals is to reduce the disparities in who is experiencing homelessness. And we cannot do that if we do not know who's accessing those services and who is successful in those services. So this information will help us meet those goals. Okay, so that is the preview of the data. I hope you all get in there and look at it, and we'd be happy to talk about it more. I do want to highlight that, again, this is a major milestone for us, but it's also one part of other work that we're doing. It is in many ways a starting point. Now that we have this data, we can better serve the community. But we're doing many other things as well. There's a lot of words on this slide, these 2 slides. I'm not going to, actually it's 3. I'm not going to go over all of them, but one thing I do want to highlight is we implemented a data mart, which helps us pull better data from our system that has to do this population dashboard, was related to that as well. We are also using that for internal work. We are implementing internal contract managing that allows us to automatically compare our contract goals and our performance, so that we can do that on an automated basis and streamline how we look at our performance of our contractors. We're looking for enhanced reporting for our SHS funding. And we are also looking at better monitoring our coordinated access program to see who is being assessed, who is being prioritized, and who is being housed. All of this is built upon better data that we're working with our IT and our data team and our vendor to get better data out of our system. We are also working on, it's not on here, or actually it's on the, go to the next slide, Megan. We have a lot of other improvements. One of those is at the very bottom, our HMIS replacement project. Our current vendor, we've had for a very long time, and it was designed for federal compliance, and it wasn't designed for the kind of insights that we want to pull from our data. So we are working on a project to replace that data system now. We are looking at a final set of vendors, and we are going to hopefully begin implementing a new vendor sometime this spring or summer. One of the things that we can't say with our data right now that we hope to be able to say with our new vendor is where are folks experiencing homelessness. We do not collect geographic data from people at this moment, and we are not able to do it automatically with our system. As we procure a new system, one of the things we are looking at is a mobile outreach tool that will collect location data as that outreach is performed. So as you meet someone at a campsite and you speak with them and you enter their data, it is collecting the GIS information about where you are, so we can get a better picture of where folks are experiencing homelessness in this community. And then finally, we are not just looking at data, we are also doing research and evaluation. And we get a lot of questions, and I wanted to highlight some things we've recently done and some things we are doing now. We are embarking on an evaluation of our rapid rehousing program in collaboration with a consultant. We are doing a pathways evaluation in collaboration with PSU, which will help us look at folks as they access service to look at what pathways through service are effective, how are folks being served, and what is serving them best. We recently completed a review of what are best practices in shelter, and that is online, and that link is there if you would like to access that report. And we also are publishing a research repository where we collect information about best practices and information on how to solve homelessness so that we can have access to that at our fingertips. We are planning to do an evaluation of outreach, and we talked a lot about inflow today, and we are planning to look further into that inflow to get a better sense of what is causing that inflow so we can help have better interventions in that arena. So I know there are probably a lot of questions. I just want to kind of summarize, and then Jillian, step in if you would like to do so. This is a major milestone for us, and it's a great starting point. We can use this data to better understand policy questions and to drive our decisions. We have many other data and research improvements that we're implementing simultaneously. And with this data, we can all work together to do better work.
Thank you. All right, it's now time for a collective deep breath.
Sorry, I talked fast.
You were perfect. And a moment of gratitude for this leap forward. And those last 3 slides really outline all of the work still to come, which will be incredibly helpful for all of us. And I just think this is just, it will help all of us, the county, our cities, Metro, forward, health share, everybody who is in this together. This is phenomenal work. So thank you to the Homeless Services Department on that. It was at this point where we have time for questions, and we can just jump straight into that. I was going to just name 2 things up front. We heard from Eco Northwest talking about key performance indicators and activities versus outcomes. Commissioner Singleton and Commissioner Brim Edwards were appointed by the chair to be in the metro space for that conversation. So we're bringing that message into that space as well. We are also, in light of this new data, as a team at the county level, looking at and working with community solutions to, okay, what is that system-wide KPI that we should set that is an outcome, because we don't have that in our current set of KPIs. So know that we're thinking about that. We're working with community solutions. We will bring that discussion back into this space, but you, by all means, you are able to speak to it today as well. In addition to just looking at our current 4 KPIs, and are there any tweaks or revisitation that we need to do there? So know that as a team, we are already thinking about that, but we welcome your initial feedback and thoughts on that the system-wide and the 4 existing KPIs as well. And then I will just also want to name one thing before I kick it back to the group, is we're also working with community solutions, particularly in partnership with City of Portland folks, on some sort of convening, hopefully in the next 2 months, to have community solutions here on the ground to meet with us and all of our jurisdictional partners around this new data, to gain just that shared understanding and learnings about how we work this list together to achieve the outcomes that we all want to achieve in our community. So I just wanted to name those 2 sort of next steps as things that we are currently thinking about. So with that, I will just open it to questions for either Eco Northwest or Homeless Services Department, et cetera. Who wants to start? Right here.
Anna, thank you so much for that presentation. I was excited last time, and I'm like more excited now. 2 things jumped out for me as I think future opportunities, and it's something I echoed, I think, last time I spoke as well when we met. But I am curious about, and this might be in one of the last slides you shared around the analytical improvements, how you guys are going to go about obtaining information from folks that get into permanent supported housing, that how they are able to successfully maintain that, and when they're not able to successfully maintain that. Because what I see, and that goes to my second kind of question of opportunity, is when folks aren't able to be successful in permanent supported housing, They then fall on safety net systems, and I'm a hospital social worker. And what we see in those systems are chronically unhoused patients. Those are folks in their community, houseless folks in our community who have chronic complex medical and psychosocial needs and who are coming to us sometimes because they lost their housing. And then they're using the emergency department and our hospital systems as their safety net. And so wanting to know that and sort of how, again, how are we thinking about those safety net systems and including them in the conversation and identifying those folks that are in that chronic aspect and then who cycle in that manner. And I think that then correlates to what's making them successful. And partly what I've also heard from community partners as far as when individuals aren't able to maintain success in permanent supported housing is the lack of support to our community members that are engaging and providing complex, supports to this population. So, and I know that we already highlighted that in like the measure of increasing housing to that, but also not forgetting and losing sight of the fact that we also have a shortage of qualified mental health professionals in our community. That there are concerns for how adequately those individuals are paid, how much interest we're spurring and getting folks into those work fields, how easily they are burnt out in providing supports and maintaining people in those housing. So just making sure that like all of those sort of things are future steps of thinking about the holistic picture of our community and every aspect, every person involved of maintaining the success of keeping people into permanent supported housing.
Ryan, do you want to speak to our existing KPI around PSH?
Well, so and Anna showed what this looks like at a systems level. We do track retention in permanent supportive housing. So we're able to see that basic retention rate. I think you're going the next step deeper, which is for those folks who aren't retaining their housing. Where are they touching other systems and how can we help to improve their outcomes? One of the pieces that I'm also excited about, this is a major advancement in how we track data across our full community. And that's a level of nuance I don't want folks to lose. Sometimes we talk about separate sets of services administered by the city or the county. All of what Anna talked about today is inclusive of all of those. So it's a full system perspective. We have the ability to start to marry some of that system level data that touches homeless services with some of our major health system data sets like Medicaid claims data and utilization data that can help to point to some of the complexity of what you're getting at. And then there's just the real human interactions that hospital social workers have every day. And so we're also engaged in convening social workers, discharge planners to say, what are you seeing on the ground that would actually make a difference so that we don't always have to wait just for the numbers data, but for what we see, what folks are seeing on the front lines every day to help people.
Just on this point, rehousing people is a core component of the fidelity model of PSH. Are we doing that? Is that because we do a lot of site-based, and I know that can be difficult then if somebody loses a site-based placement on how they stay in PSH. And are we talking about retention of housing of just that initial unit that they were placed in? Or are we talking about they're still housed even if they were rehoused?
So this metric would be housed even if they are rehoused. So it's not from that initial placement. But I think to your point, when we look at that number of folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness, if we assume many of those folks would benefit from permanent supportive housing, we know, as you said, our ability to provide that intensive wraparound services, that is the basis of Housing First, right? Housing First assumes that you can provide people with the services they need to stay in that housing. I think we struggle as a community to really be at that level. So what I hear you highlighting is it's very important and we have some challenges there. And how are we going to look into that? I think that's a great thing. We're focusing on a rapid rehousing evaluation right now, but that doesn't mean we can't also look at how are we serving folks in permanent supportive housing? Are we actually meeting their need, or could we do a better job there?
That mayor, sorry.
You said mayor and didn't follow anything. I knew it was that one.
Am I that mayor? Anna, thank you very much for this information. I know how sobering this is, and we all want to deliver good news. And it's these numbers are measured in suffering. And I know how heartfelt it is. And thank you for calling me and giving me the information a couple days in advance, and how Portland has reacted and how our partnership is reacting. Is I spoke to our entire leadership team, all the senior leaders. 20 of us convened in the Rose Room. We had our incident command meeting on Monday. And we knew what was going on. Sorry. It's
been a long week.
I'm trying to gather myself. We have Portland Solutions. We have an incident command meeting every Monday, and we go over what the last week entailed and what the next week will entail, because it's an emergency and we're adjusting it as such. And we talked about this, but I was very clear with everybody in these meetings and all of my senior leaders, if they are in my administration, answer the litmus test that we're going to focus on ending unsheltered homelessness this year. That's an outcome-based issue. We'll address the activity it requires to take it. These numbers are sobering because it means that the goalpost just got moved further away from us. It's not a negative. If the mission is clear, if the outcome is focused, we simply adjust to it. And that's what they all are going to do now. So we're just simply going to adjust to it, because these are our neighbors that we've got to address now, not next year, not in 3 years, not in 5 years. It just reinforces our call to action and the strength that our partnership has got to yield. And Mayor Stovall called me just a few weeks ago. I'm ready to help. Here's what resources I can give. And the chair and I have had some very deep discussions on what does improvements in our community look like, with the governor as well. Difficult conversations, but it's yielding results. And I'm happy to say that. We're shaking things up and we're focusing on helping the community now. And again, not next year. We can't focus on next year. It has to be right now. The HRAP system promises to deliver 1,000 beds to reduce unsheltered homelessness by 50%. That's activity and that's outcome. The 50% is a critical thing we have to focus on this year. I note that because Dr. Wilkerson, I look at your slide, page 17, it states that we've added rapid rehousing beds, 3.7 thousand in the time frame, and permanent housing, permanent supportive housing, 3.5 thousand beds. Pardon me, permanent supportive housing, 5.5 thousand beds, and permanent housing, 3.5 thousand beds. But in shelter in that period, 1,000. 1,000 while we let the suffering continue to increase in a skyrocketing sense. I say it's an equation, and we've got to address the inputs equally along that equation. And so Portland is committed to 1,500 beds and even more if we need to address the other 50%, because our collective partnership has got to focus on caring for everybody in the community despite what state they're in. And so that's what we're focused on. And then reunification. I hope you received my email last week. Our partnership through PA and county and Portland Police and our outreach, we connected Giovanni with his mother in Brooklyn. He was frightened to call her. We got him home after only a few hours because of our collective efforts. And we removed his misdemeanors so he could start a new life in Brooklyn with his mother. The goal is to take the pressure off of our system so our outreach workers and our housing teams can focus on the long-term solution that's adding housing. That is what you'd noted is the solution. It's a housing problem, so let's address it. So more of statements. After seeing the numbers, it's sobering. It's a gut check. It means we have more hard and important work to do, and our partnership is yielding results and changes. And thank you for helping us with overnight shelter. Chair, I can't thank you enough for just helping look at the continuum and focus on all the parts and pieces and not discounting any, but looking at whatever it is, throw it in and let's get going. So thank you all. And I know these meetings are important. So more of a statement on the
Thank you.
results.
So I have Mayor Stovall and then Commissioner Singleton, and then I want to make sure our non-elected folks have a chance to.
We're going to do some questions. I think we have questions for data we need to get to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So ultimately, I tend to be an internal optimist. I'll put that out there. Although I can tell you that seeing the data that just came out is quite sobering, as Mayor Wilson just referenced. It is quite alarming to see that increase when we are investing so many dollars and so much attention to this effort. I will say that with that as the foundation, I sit here incredibly encouraged with the data that we're now collecting. For so many years, out in Gresham, we've heard the PIT count, point in time count, just isn't sufficient to capture the magnitude of the problem. And we've heard that for so long. And to have something now that I believe will actually deliver something that's way more confident as we begin to address the issue is the encouraging component. We also now have an ability, has already been referenced. I think Ryan mentioned this. We also have the ability to track across all the different service providers, the different entities, the different cities and counties. We now have that ability to do that, which has been missing and lacking historically. And so I think that's something that's going to be extremely helpful as we, again, try to measure the magnitude of the problem, but address the problem. Being data informed is great, but data doesn't solve problems. It doesn't in and of itself solve problems. The thing that I sit here in wonderment is the presentation that Eco Northwest made highlighting what really is the core problem. We heard something very similar at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting from the Pew Research Center. Homelessness is a housing problem. But then I also heard that this isn't something that this table is really dealing with. I guess I'm confused in the sense that if that's the biggest problem, but yet we're being held to a standard that to solve homelessness, but yet the biggest solution to our problem exists outside of this purview. That's where I have the confusion. That's where I'm challenged with the conversation in and of how does our data collection, and this is both for you, Anna, and our folks from Eco Northwest, what are the metrics? And I'm a person who believes in the vital few. We can have 15 different data points, but yet there's really 3 to 5 that really point towards whether or not we are doing a good job, or those 3 to 5 data points are the points that essentially what gets measured gets done. So if we're focusing on these. So and again, you've got the largest county in Oregon, the largest city, the 4th largest city in the state, that's Gresham. If you guys didn't know, it's like, who are you talking about, Gresham? 2nd largest in the Portland region, on the Oregon side. I mean, so we're all dealing with these things. And I think we have more of a comprehensive opportunity to address these issues. So I think this table, and both Mayor Wilson and I and Commissioner Singleton, we do sit at the Metro table. I think at this table, you also have some input and some insight and some influence on the housing piece that, of course, as we deal with housing starts, multifamily housing starts, that's something that we're not just seeing in the city of Portland, we're also seeing that in Gresham, and there's reasons for that. But what are the data points that would allow us at quote unquote this level of data collection and delivery and what we're working on that really points towards that core problem, which is housing supply, affordable housing supply? Because if that's really the solution, then everything we do down here isn't going to really impact that in the long term. We're going to see people cycling out of housing through evictions and things like that, which you just noted. I can't remember whose data point that was, but I believe it's yours, Anna, that mentioned we're at the highest level of evictions. I mean, that's alarming. So it's a broad question, but ultimately, if I could summarize, it's really about what are the key data points that we should be looking at that will tell us whether or not we even have the capacity to solve the problem if it's outside of the essential purview of this group.
So one thing before you all answer, I do want to make very clear, this table is exactly where we should be talking about housing. And that was the impetus behind establishing this, the HRS for Multnomah County, because the Homeless Services Department can't solve that piece of the puzzle, right? They're out there doing the work that's within their purview, but the housing piece, the healthcare piece, those things we know have huge impacts on our ability to address this issue. That's why we have Ivory Matthews from Home Forward at this table. That's why we have Mindy from HealthShare at this table. And that's why we are really looking at jurisdictions coming together to really have that holistic conversation about this. So yeah, I mean, and that's why like this presentation I think is so timely. We can't just sit here and talk only about the pieces of the system that are controlled by or impacted by the homeless services department, or even the work that's happening with the city in the solutions, but we have to be really talking about the bigger issues as well. So thanks. So I just wanted to like put a pin in that, because that is exactly what we should be talking about here.
I was gonna talk about your data, so.
I mean, I think what I would say is when you talk about housing and housing affordability, the lion's share of the focus is on housing, and rightly so, but the other half of the equation is also income. And so highlighting economic development as a priority, I think, has to be thought of as in the same light of the urgency around housing supply. What I would say is, through the recently adopted ONA production targets, what that is attempting to do is bring the housing market into balance. And so from a KPI standpoint, that is one now metric that is out there, will be updated with regularity around jurisdictions meeting not only the number of units, but incrementally an income distribution that's roughly in line with that new increment of need, and whether that's through population growth or demographic change or loss of second and vacation homes. That's one half of the equation. I think what ONA, I would say, lacks is the next step, which is that one slide that I got to, which is even when your housing market is in relative balance from let's say a vacancy rate standpoint, and that's really what ONA is trying to do. Are you then satisfied with the level of cost burden that you're seeing in your community? Because what a balanced housing market does over decades is get you to that point in time. And we know historically that has happened in the past. What ONA, I think, let's say, is one of the known weaknesses is in the short run. If people are experiencing increased risk of homelessness, even though you are building enough housing, is what are other measures that you can use? And I think cost burdening is one of the best, if not the best measure of that immediacy of that risk, particularly for low-income households. It suggests that there's the need for other policy interventions beyond just building housing. So again, I think, if you're looking for metrics, are you meeting your goals towards ONA? Are you getting into better balance, which is going to be a long run benefit? And I think that the question is, in the short run, what are those other gaps in policies that can be prioritized to reduce that risk of people through eviction and other means losing their housing?
I'll just quickly chime in that, to avoid jargon, ONA is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, which is the new reform of the Goal 10 housing planning requirements imparted by the state Department of Land Conservation and Development. So it's a new methodology that has a better and more accurate assessment of how many housing units each jurisdiction, each city should be producing, cities that have to adhere to this planning requirement, and both by income level and collectively over their planning time horizon. So the long run, it took decades to get into this position of underproduction. It'll take decades to get out, but cities are going to be held to a higher standard of accountability with this program as well. And it should, in the long run, move the needle towards housing production and a better balance, like Mike said.
They pretty much said it. I really like the slide, your complicated slide. I really like it. I think it's focusing, if we're talking about homelessness specifically, looking at that 0 to 30. What is the availability of that? And I say 0 to 30. What housing is affordable for folks at 0 to 30% of median income? Because that median income, that complicated slide, I think that is a really important set of data points to look at to understand, do we have enough housing to serve our most vulnerable folks?
Yeah, the technical definition is, it's affordable and available. Affordable alone just tells you does your stock. The availability is that crucial piece that is married with that to let you know about that elevated level of risk, particularly for low-income households.
And I just want to be clear, the city of Portland has done that foundational work. So we know the need by income level, and it's large, but we know we've got the target, which is good.
That's a quick follow-up question. So again, in the data set, if this is so critical and so important, is this a component of our data that we have available to us in the dashboard? I mean, because essentially this is the magnitude of the possible solution. I think the public and our elected leaders should have that component available to them from a data collection standpoint, even in this data sharing. I think because we talk about the problem, but yet we don't actually talk about the solution and what are the communal contributions to the solution. And I think they need to know what the potential is for the solution side of the problem.
What's not on this dashboard is this is really focused in on what the homeless services department does, which is
I get it.
homeless services, but doesn't mean we can't find a way to have that be just as important of a part of the conversation on a regular basis.
And potentially linked, right? If
Yeah.
the city of Portland has a lot of this on their website,
Yeah,
how
can
do we
we
just
provide a,
populate some links?
yeah.
And the state has 2 new dashboards about tracking production and a series of housing equity indicators, both live Tableau dashboards from Oregon Housing and Community Services. And then I would imagine that every city's kind of housing production strategy is part of that Goal 10 housing planning requirement. Those are conducted every 6 years in the metro region, 8 years outside. And I believe there's annual kind of reporting updates. So while this table, this chart wouldn't be in the county's dashboard that was just released, it should likely be available in other types of planning documents, updated with some frequency.
There's also the opportunity, HRS, the homeless services, we have a website and dashboard as well that we may be able to link to some of these key pieces. Thank you for the indulgence.
So there's I'm gonna jump in because we've got like 14 minutes left and there's other people besides me who have questions too. One, I want to just reemphasize the 0 to 30% issue, and our pipeline is really scary when you look at it for that income level. And that's going to be our folks who are chronically homeless. That is the folks who are always going to be on a fixed income because they have a permanent disability, right? That income is never going to pay rent in Portland. The market has never built for that population, and it's not suddenly going to. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to that. Can we get the slides? There's a bunch of links, but we don't have them actually visually, so paper doesn't work. Thank you. How does the new data change any assumptions that underlie the HRAP? And if that's a bigger conversation, we can parking lot it. But the changes of the 2024 data alone indicates that there's some revisiting that needs to happen on goals.
In complete agreement in 2 ways. One, a KPIs discussion. So we're thinking about it and we're going to have that discussion in this space. And then 2, it is my opinion that we can, now that we have this dashboard inflow outflow, that the plan needs to be, let's call it a reorientation to this data. And so we are starting that work with an eye toward the end of the year of sort of giving it a refresh. Let's call it HRAP 2.0. And then bridging back for a second to KPIs. Our KPIs do need to make sense to the metro KPIs. Those are regional ones. So that needs to be hand in hand as well that you'll bring into the metro space. So all things yes to what you said.
I've said this to the department before, and I know it's not just homeless services department, so I want to acknowledge that. We have got to start collecting retention data for our prevention investments and make sure that we're capturing when they're returning to homelessness. I feel like we can't say if prevention is effective or not. We know it is immediately, but we don't know what it means for the long term. And that feels really important to understand. And what is, with returns to homelessness, what is the time frame that we're using from when they were placed?
For the retention metric?
For when we're saying people return to homelessness from a program we permanently house them in, is it after a year? Is it 2 years? Is it indefinite?
I'm looking at my data person.
We tend to maintain 2 years of housing data, so they would have had an ID that shows that they moved in within the last 2 years, and then we're seeing them flowing back into homelessness. They might show up as new to our list if it's longer than 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I did want to mention we are tracking prevention as well. It's actually intended to be part of the next part of our dashboard. So we're just actually refining that right now, and we're able to use the binding list to see if people are flowing into the binding list from our prevention data to look at that. So it's not just a calling up and seeing if they're still homeless, or still housed. So that is also planned for the next phase.
And to be clear, I don't think we fund enough robustly on retention, so it's no fault of providers, but it's information that has been hard to capture. So I'm glad that's happening. Thank you. I'll save the rest for later.
I believe Councilor Zimmerman was next. Is that right, Chair?
That would be great. On Page 10 for Eco Northwest, you said that these factors were unrelated: serious mental illness, illicit drug use, substance use disorder, poverty rates, January temperatures. And then on the 18th slide, you talked about the difference between the sheltered and the unsheltered is quite close in the temperate climates, is something you offered up. I'm making a connection here that I think we need a little bit more between the both groups, because with that statement, and that it's just about housing, it also, with respect to the joint offices data on page 11, that other factors make people's circumstances or likelihood of becoming homeless worse, including fentanyl crisis and the need for more mental health assistance. One of my overarching questions with this data is that how many people are, because I really appreciate your comments, Commissioner. There are some folks in this community that we are always going to pay all the rent for. And I think it's good to admit that and talk about who those are. But how many people are purely they're facing a homeless question, poverty based, and others who are facing a homeless question because of the inability to hold a job, whether it be because of current drug use or because of untreated mental illness. To say it's just related to housing is, I think, a sentence with a comma and nothing behind it, because there are other factors that you both have cited: temperate, access to healthcare, access to treatment. So I'd like to see a way in which the data can be supportive of furthering that work and not relying on it's just a capacity thing. There's one thing I keep hearing from providers is I'm being forced to take a person who is not ready to be in a housing situation, and then they are being very destructive to that housing and having an unsuccessful experience in the unit. It gets to my other question that I wonder where we can plug this in is, are our retention rates better or worse for those that are placed in housing from shelter or from the street directly? I'm also interested if the data will at any time capture where a person is coming into our system from, and I don't mean from housing or from the street, but I mean from Vancouver, from Beaverton, from California in the last 3 years, and get an idea for why we see such huge difference in numbers between the 3 counties. And I think that we have to test some hypothesis here to either know what we need to work on or prove a talking point that's out in the community is either right or wrong. And I think that's an area that I'm looking for some data help on. And then how does the active or inactive status get placed on a person who is not at a shelter, but is engaged? They're just street camping. So we have time counted this. So they're in our 14,000 number. I'm assuming that, but then they are not considered active because they're not participating in any services. Is that the best way to think about the term active or inactive?
So if that person was camping and didn't access any services whatsoever and didn't meet with an outreach worker whatsoever for 90 to 180 days, they might be moved to inactive. But if they talked with an outreach worker and that outreach worker documented that interaction, if they went to a day center that enters their information into HMIS, if they picked up their mail somewhere, any of those interactions with folks that are funded by our programming, that would be entered into it. So they would be considered active because they would be documented accessing one of those services. And that does include that outreach interaction of somebody coming and speaking to them and having a conversation.
Thanks. I hope that at some point we can get into what determines a priority population when we looked at that data. When we look at that slide, I've never been in an organization who doesn't want to talk about the largest portion of the problem that they have identified as the most important problem, but we seem to skew away from that. So I'm curious how we're going to determine target populations and how those investments will go. And then just in terms of as an oversight board here, that this role, this group, how are we going to, I guess, ensure a certain level of transparency as the data comes in that perhaps isn't good or isn't favorable? And I guess I say that from a perspective of what is the insurance of to the public that even if the numbers come back poorly, that we're going to share that data and not hold it back from the dashboard? And it goes along with one of the in-depth evaluations that have already happened. It says best practices shelter report. I haven't read that yet. I look forward to it. I didn't realize it was done. But just knowing kind of the history of the joint office, the history of the city and the county's perspective on whether shelter was or was not something to invest in a few years ago, who determines a best practice in a shelter and for whom? Those are kind of things that come off the page. It's like, I want to be able to trust these assumptions that come out of the data, but at this point, there's been so much work to, I think, I guess I'm in a position where I'm still trying to build some trust that those assumptions that are being worked on from the Homeless Services Department reflect where the city is at and reflect where other elected leaders sometimes are at. And I'm not sure about that yet. So that's one of those kind of questions of how do we ensure transparency of data and who is determining what a best practice is when we use that data to develop conclusions. But you know, the good thing for today for me, colleagues, is that this data exists. I think the rest of the report is alarming as hell, right? 26% increase is very problematic, but I also appreciate the amount of work that has gone into having this point in time, and by name is very helpful. So I don't want that part lost at all, but thank you.
If I may, does one of our members have an urgent question? I just want to interject on a few points. If not. Commissioner Singleton, do you mind speaking to yesterday's work session, which was, in my opinion, the starting point about understanding our shelter continuum and outcomes? Will you speak to that for the counselor?
I said, do you mind? So no. So we had a work session that included data from city and county shelters of all types to look at both cost per bed as well as outcomes by different types. So we were able to assess length of stay, positive outcomes as in they went into recovery, they went into other permanent housing, any kind of housing outcome, so that we could start to think about as a board in a year that we have budget restraints, how do we meet HRAP goals with the current structure of our shelters? And one of the things that I think is hard is we might have to close something that's more expensive to open things that are cheaper if the focus is the goal, but we know we can still get outcomes. A big takeaway, I think won't be surprised to anybody here, is better housing outcomes came with rent assistance and staff to do services and housing placement work. So as we've seen constraints in the budget, we've seen this year decreases in placement outcomes for some of the shelter sites that have less money. So not super surprising, but I think a helpful conversation. And part of what we wanted to start talking about is what is the role of shelter in our community and how do we bring some equity into the shelter? My housing placement shouldn't rely on which shelter I happen to get into. And so how do we think about housing services? Does it need to be more mobile as opposed to site-based, and starting to wrestle with some of that? We'll have a follow-up session on the 29th that is about outreach, in-reach, and navigation. And we'll also again include both city and county data and information. So I'm not going to pretend it's like super short. It's like an hour, but if folks do want to see, you should look at it, or at a minimum, the data is all available in what our board materials from yesterday.
And then finally, I know we only have a few more minutes, but given some other remarks made by Councilor Zimmerman, Anna, will you explain the difference in how Multnomah County does its pig count and the data augmentation that we do versus the other two counties?
Yeah. But before that, I do want to say, we'll send you the report, Councilor Zimmerman, and it is very clear about what they're using for the standards, and they're primarily from organizations like the National Alliance to End Homelessness. So it's national criteria on what is considered best practice in shelter to answer that question, but that's outlined in the report. So for the last 3 iterations of the point in time count, is it 3, Lori? We have sort of made our count more robust. So when people think of the point in time count, what they think about is going out and interviewing people, doing a survey, and that's like the street count of folks experiencing homelessness. As I said, we've been working to make our sort of administrative data on who is experiencing homelessness better for a very long time. So over the last 3 iterations, we have taken an additional step that is not required and that other jurisdictions do not do, which is to look at our administrative data on who we understand to be homeless and crosswalk that with the point in time count to say, hey, there's some folks that we didn't capture in a survey that we're pretty sure are homeless. We're gonna add that to our list so we can get the best possible data. Again, that's what we had at the time on who was experiencing homelessness. So we've been doing that for the past, this will be our third iteration of doing that. That's one of the reasons that, for example, there's a soundbite about Oregon having the highest level of family homelessness in the nation. It's because families are not counted in the PID reliably, but they are counted in our administrative data. So when we report that information to our local jurisdictions, when we report it to HUD, it looks like we have a higher population of families, but it's because we're being more responsible than we need to be to account for who's homeless in our community.
The cause of my heartburn when we're compared nationally because we're better.
It's not everyone's favorite thing we do.
Anyway, Chair.
Yeah, and just one thing that I want to say, because I know we're wrapping up now, so I'm happy to do that. I don't want anybody leaving this room thinking that, like what was said here, and Madeline, I really appreciate the way that you phrased this, that housing is a community driver of homelessness, but our solutions have to take into account the mental health, the addiction, all of these other factors that have to be part of the solution for individuals who are experiencing homelessness. It is not an either or, it is a both and. And I think that's really important because that's really at the, again, why it's not just about housing, it's also about healthcare. It's also about the homeless services work that's happening as we have these conversations. So I want you to, I mean, I heard you say it and I don't want you to take away like somebody saying it's only housing. Housing though is a huge driver at the macro level for this. And that is a conversation. That's why I think the governor has been raising up this issue, that we've seen the changes in what's being required of local governments to have plans for that. And then I think it's also like we just have how we have to be advocates for the services around healthcare, around homeless services. We also have to be advocating for faster and more investments in housing development as well. So just wanted to add that. I really appreciate the excellent data that we've had today, where we are. You know, I have said, like, I think that we are at the point where you know, the numbers are showing an increase in people experiencing or who have been identified as experiencing homelessness. For me, this means that next month when the data changes, or in 3 months or 6 months or a year, it is not because the way that we're counting is changing or who we're counting is changing. It is truly because it is a difference in what's happening on the street. So we can say, you know, in 6 months if data has improved or not improved, it's really because that we need to be doing better, or what we are doing is working, and it's not just because we're looking at the data differently. And that is a really important point that we've been trying to get to for a long time. So I want to thank the Homeless Services Department. I want to thank our data teams that have been doing this incredible work to get us to this point. What the data is telling us is we still have a lot of work to do, and we have to be doing that with all urgency. We have to be expanding what we're doing and operating on many different fronts to make the difference. But we know now where we are, and this is giving us the path to go forward. It will be incredibly helpful as elected officials and other policymakers are really looking for those solutions that are going to make the difference. And this gives us the data we need to do that. So thanks again, everyone. Our next meeting is coming up. What? Friday, May 9th. Friday, May 9th. Thank you so much. Appreciate everybody's time and attendance today. With that, here.